Hello. So this will be the last video for this writing. I've been reading a memoir that a friend of mine wrote, I guess in 2011. He thought he was going to die in 2010, and in 2011 he hadn't died. By the end of the year, he started writing his memoirs after I made a book of photographs from his youth. We had found a bunch of stuff while we were trying to clean out his house so that people wouldn't have to do it after he died and just throw everything away. So yeah, he got to writing, and he wrote from his earliest childhood memories up until about the time he was getting ready to leave New York, which is around 1970. But then he lost his computer, and although he had made notes for what he wanted to continue writing, he never got around to writing that. He lived for another 4 years, but he just never got around to writing. So I'm going to finish reading this now, and we'll see where we go from there. So this is taking place about, I believe, 1968 in New York City. Soon after moving into my place on East 96th Street at Lexington Avenue, I became active at St. Francis de Sales Roman Catholic Church, a rather attractive turn-of-the-century neo-Baroque edifice about a half a block from my apartment on East 96th Street. Even while I was still involved at St. Hedwig's in Floral Park, I had been part of that first generation of liturgical change which was happening in those years right after the Second Vatican Council. So naturally, I stepped forward at St. Francis to offer my services as an already experienced lector to read the scripture lessons in English in the otherwise still Latin Mass. I also wound up making vestments for them to accommodate the new look. After a late breakfast, we still fasted before communion at that time, at my apartment following Sunday Mass, my favorite routine was to walk across East 96th Street to Fifth Avenue and down along the edge of Central Park to the world-famous Metropolitan Museum of Art at 83rd Street. There was no fixed admission fee, and so even a poor boy like myself could spend the entire afternoon lost in a whole world of time and space. Looking back, I was quite systematical in my approach to the inexhaustible riches of the Met, as she was called. On any given afternoon, I could go from primitive to early 20th century art, in one of the life-changing special exhibits or the magnificent standing collections. I learned that even I could only take in so much at a time, so I had to choose one gallery and live in it for the day. When I was trying to get ideas for my little apartment, I took in the American wing, which had period rooms and other interiors from the early colonial period up to Francis Lloyd Wright. I studied a room at a time, noting the scale and proportions of the room, the lighting, the manner of decoration, and the minute details of the furnishings. I would wrestle with what I felt most at home with and what I could live in should I be forced to choose. Then I would imagine how I could translate this vision to my studio apartment and recreate it out of furnishings I might find in the scores of second-hand shops I haunted. Close-out fabric stores, or better yet, off the streets of New York, gift to the mayor. It was incredible what New Yorkers would throw away, especially if you worked the right neighborhoods on garbage night. Other times, when I was not preoccupied with decor, I would be drawn into the massive medieval gallery with the soaring iron grille from some great monastery, or 3-story high tapestries hung from the ceiling. This gallery was filled with sculptures and paintings, and most interestingly of all, to me, ecclesiastical treasures. I would learn soon of the Cloisters, an affiliate of the Met in Upper Manhattan, which had the bulk of the medieval collections. Then there was the ancient world to explore: Assyria, Persia, Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and of course, Rome. Some days I would be in the mood for the Baroque or the Romantic period paintings. It was here that I began my lifelong love of the Impressionists. I usually found enough in my pocket to take a break in one of the museum's cafes and sit there in my Sunday suit like I was up with the best of them, nurse a cup of coffee, and relentlessly watch people. Walking the different neighborhoods was another favorite activity if the weather was pleasant, or even if it was just passable. When it got chilly or drizzly, I would duck into one of the numerous piano bars, gay or straight, and for the price of one drink, take in hours of music, and even run into someone I knew or just got to know. There were many good times along the way as the rest of 1968 wrapped up with the Christmas holidays, Louis at home with his family and I with my folks in Floral Park. That New Year's Eve I went out late, after the ball dropped, to Harry's back east, my neighborhood bar, to have a drink to myself. Before long I got to talking to a handsome guy from Spain, Juan Luis Fernandez, who had recently moved to New York and opened a little gallery in Greenwich Village selling art reproductions he was importing from his homeland. Already interested in people from faraway places, I enjoyed our conversation and his European charm. He gave me his business card as we headed out at closing time into the new year. He was planning on taking a cab back down to the village. It had been snowing quite hard while I was in the bar, and the wind was blowing us around on the frozen snow-covered sidewalk. Juan walked up 3rd Avenue with me towards my place while hoping to flag a taxi. Quite an impossibility on New Year's morning in the snow. We were wet and frozen by the time, and I invited him to stay at my place until things got moving again in the morning. We became good friends from then on, once he got over the crush he had on me. 1969. 1969 proved to be a quite tumultuous year, even though it started off without a bang. Life in the United States of America was very uneasy throughout this time. The Vietnam War was constantly escalating and the draft was grabbing everyone they could, except me. I was given an 1Y status when I turned 18 because of the troubles with my feet, legs, and back. I also had respiratory problems and who knows what else, that if drafted, Uncle Sam would be responsible for until I died. At some point around 1969, I was reclassified a 4F, and so I was untouchable. My brother James checked the box that he was a homosexual, and after numerous scrutinies, he was also rejected. Almost all of my classmates had been drafted, and a few had already come back injured and maimed, and a few died. Through all this, we had the president elections, and Richard M. Nixon won, and he was inaugurated on January 20th. In the spring, Louis talked about an idea of us going to California in June to visit a friend of his, Bob, who was recently relocated from New York City to Los Angeles. At some point, Doris, Louis's wife, agreed, and we made our plans. Just before we were to depart for Los Angeles, the news broke from London that Judy Garland had been found dead on June 22nd. It immediately sent shockwaves through New York's underground homosexual circles. I was aware of her popular songs, I guess, and her role as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, but otherwise I knew nothing about her. If there was an entrance exam before being a homosexual, I would have never made it past lesbian. Louis wanted to show me the already gathering crowds of mostly gay men outside of the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel on Madison Avenue and 81st Street on the Upper East Side. With his connections, he could have gotten us into the private viewing, but I was not that interested. I never remember seeing so many gay men of all ages in public as they kept vigil on the sidewalks around Campbell's in advance of the June 27th private funeral service for Judy. As soon as we got to Los Angeles, Louis got word from some strange going-ons in Greenwich Village. His fellow cop friend, Freddie, called to tell him in the early hours of June 28th the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street had been raided, which was pretty routine. But what was heretofore unheard of is the fact that the patrons fought back and a full-scale riot had erupted. The police were trapped in the bar and had to call for backups to rescue them. What is more, demonstrations in the streets around there were occurring on the following nights. I thought it sounded like a bit of an exaggeration, but then it was all on the news, all the way out in Los Angeles. Louis was now eager to get his hands on the inside reports as soon as we got back to New York. Well, the revolution just started without me. Meanwhile, for the next 2 weeks, we were on the West Coast for the first time. California amazed me visually. Everything was in Technicolor. I was struck by the natural beauty of the place. The skies were bluer, the foliage greener, and the earth and rocks varied from hues to shades of purple. From golden hues to shades of purple. Not that we did not have that color in New York. There was black and white and a range of browns and every shade of gray from ash to soot. Air pollution was a major blight on everything in New York, but when I arrived in Los Angeles, the air stung my eyes and it took me a week to adjust to the specific pollution there. Louis and I stayed in the LA ranch-style house that Bob and his boyfriend rented in the Laurel Canyon area of Hollywood in Los Angeles. The boyfriend was a pretty blonde, wispy guy around my age who was Bob's secretary at the office, the perfect housewife at home. The idea was that we would befriend each other while Louis and Bob caught up. I cannot now remember his name, but to say that I disliked him would have implied a much deeper emotion than I could have ever feel for him. What I did dislike was the implication by Louis that I should be more like, what's-his-name, the adoring, compliant lover whose sole purpose in life was to please his husband. I did not quite buy into that role, nor did I play it well, even if we were in Hollywood. They were, of course, gracious hosts and took us all over Hollywood, Malibu, Santa Monica, and Venice Beach. We regularly went to a coffee shop on the corner of Hollywood and Vine, where there was a campy waitress named Margot who endlessly poured coffee every time your cup was half empty. In New York, at that time, you were charged separately for every cup. I also discovered that you could have anything to eat as long as it was a hamburger, albeit with an incredible assortment of trimmings, even themes. Bob threw a party for us, and I was amazed that I found their friends even more superficial than they were. There was one, though, who I found amusing, a tall, handsome young fellow from rural Georgia who had a big natural smile and a crop of hair the color of a bale of hay. He had wonderful stories from home about he and his friends going down to the Greyhound bus station just to play with the flush toilets, and another one about getting up in his sister's clothes to seduce an old farmer into giving him free watermelons. In the end, when the old guy realized the ruse, the farmer got what he wanted anyway. We were driven down to San Diego and Tijuana one day with this Georgia fellow and another friend of theirs who thought he was so straight-appearing. After lunch in Tijuana, which was not a hamburger, we were walking along the main drag and were accosted, not unusually, by a little 9-year-old Mexican boy who tugged at our sleeves and blurted out to each of us, "Mister, you come to my house. I have sister who is cherry." When the little boy got to Mr. Straight, he said, as he extended his hands out about a yard apart, "Mister, I have brother with bicho this big." We laughed all the way back to Los Angeles. Before we left Los Angeles, Bob and boyfriend took us out to Studio City in the San Fernando Valley to see the new dream house they were having custom built. I was supposed to be impressed with the white marble French provincial mantelpiece that was already in place. What I did notice was the flimsiness of the construction and materials that looked to me like a movie set, thinking to myself that New York cockroaches would have this place for lunch in one day. Less than 2 years later, the house was totaled in an earthquake that leveled the valley. They were safe, I later learned. Not having been offered any movie contracts, I returned to a very different New York City. The nightly demonstrations had by then melted into a general wave of activity by young gay men on the streets of the village as the summer heat blistered. Christopher Street, a main cross street, had become a gay thoroughfare every night, and the late-night places were bustling with excitement. The whole atmosphere had changed overnight. Guys no longer scurried furtively from dive to dark bar, but paraded defiantly under the watchful gaze of the uniformed police and the dreaded plainclothes cops. A new era had begun. I could not wait to get into my hip-hugger bell-bottoms and make my way down there to take it all in. This did not please Louis, because he worried, not unreasonably, that if I was noticed around there by any cops who recognized me as his friend, or even worse, picked up for something, his job would be on the line. Louis never knew that just a month before the now famous Stonewall raid, I was taken there by Robert, a rather effeminate former dancer who had been around a while. I thought the place was rather seedy and not my kind of crowd. Just as we were on the way out, the police barged in and announced that we were all under arrest and had to stay put. We were just at the door, but a big plainclothes police cop was blocking it. Robert whispered, just follow me. And with that he discreetly yanked on the corner of a dust-laden velvet curtain that masked the front window. The whole works came down with a clatter, causing the cop on the door to jump up to see what happened. We were out of there like a greased lightning, down the street and around the corner where we were out of sight and could catch our breaths. Though somewhat older, Robert, the ex-dancer, was faster on his feet, but I was spurred on right behind him by the thought of Louis finding out that I got caught up in a raid. Robert was a veteran of many raids, and knew that it was better to be gone than to be busted. Not only was the world around me changing, the moon above was forever altered on that July 20th. Having lost my little black and white television, which my parents had given me, in one of the several break-ins in my apartment, I went over to my friend Danny's apartment on 71st Street to watch the historic event on his fuzzy-screened black and white TV. The irony did not escape us that we had now had the technology to put a man, Neil Armstrong, on the moon, but you could still not even get passable television reception in Manhattan. The event that anchored that August in the annals of history was the Woodstock Festival, billed as an antiquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music, held on a dairy farm in the Catskills, in upstate New York. It never registered on my radar, not even a blip, but it was a major milestone for my brother James, who was a year younger and a millennium away from me. I did hear from Bernadette from time to time, although she and Ray had moved out to Sag Harbor, where they built a house on a nice parcel that her mother had left her. Things were already not going so well, and more than once Bernadette came into the city and stayed with me for a few days. One time I remember she had her little Lhasa Apso dog with her. Even though she was an old friend, Louis was uncomfortable with this, as she was a married woman. The irony of this was not lost on me, given that he was married and having a relationship with me. Bernadette's being there was one subject on which I would not budge, so he backed off. But her departure always left me in that same sad, confused state of grief. Like the ongoing fact of Bernadette in my life, another chance meeting occurred late that summer, or early autumn of 1969. Somehow the people that will eventually affect the course of the rest of your life just have a way of slipping in unannounced, and you never know exactly what day it all started. At that time, I was working at the Fifth Avenue showroom of C.M. Almy & Son, outfitters to the church and clergy, as their advertisement stated. Overwhelmingly, their clientele were Episcopalian, and it never ceased to amaze me how proper, yet eccentric, the customers that I had to deal with could be. That having been said, one day 2 decidedly odd middle-aged gentlemen arrived at the showroom, and my boss, Mr. Donald F. Fendler, the conservative owner of the firm, asked me to see to them. One of these gentlemen had a mustache, the other a beard. Both had collar-length straight gray hair, faded purple jeans, and sandals on their feet. One was wearing a clergyman's type of shirt of an unusual shade of purple, not at all the deep color of the bishop's shirts we sold. As I inquired as to how I might help them, I found them both to be engagingly different, to the point of being endearing. The one with the mustache and the clergy shirt spoke very pleasantly with no discernible accent. The other was distinctly British. They were interested in ordering violet choir cassocks and sheer cotton kottas. When I took down the information for the order, I learned that the clergyman's name was Father Robert M. Clement, and that he was a priest in the Polish National Catholic Church, a denomination that I knew little about, though I had heard of. His companion, the Englishman, was John J. Noble, a seminarian. The address they furnished was 114 Christopher Street in the West Village, which seemed perfectly appropriate for their attire. The world was changing, as were hair and clothing options, but these transformations had not yet arrived at the showroom of C.M. Almy & Sons until that day. Even though I only saw them once or twice again in the months to come, they had impressed themselves on my memory in a curious but enchanting sort of way. The war in Vietnam continued to escalate, and so did the opposition, along with a rift in the society that it caused. A massive peace march was called for on October 15th, and Mayor John Lindsay had ordered the flag to be flown at half-mast for the day. Meanwhile, the city's police and firefighters, along with many ordinary citizens, drove with their headlights on to protest the protest. Even though I was not very politically engaged, and despite Louis's warnings not to do so for fear of violence, I did join one of the events, a candlelit prayer vigil in Midtown Manhattan centered around St. Patrick's Cathedral, which spilled into the side streets in every direction. I was surprised how perfectly calm the atmosphere was as we stood there in silence holding our candles as the whole mass was aglow in the night. It was ironic we were gathered around this very place, the city's most focal house of prayer, since Cardinal Spellman, who had died less than 2 years earlier, made a career out of going out to bless the bombers, and the war was often referred to as Spelly's War. My relationship with Louis had its ups and downs, to say the least, but we had worked out a regular schedule together that was distracted by his irregular work schedule and his obligation to his family. When we did go out together to a gay bar or restaurant, it was always somewhat uncomfortable, as he had to keep an eye on the door in case he might be recognized by any uniformed police who came in to check on things and get their bribe, or if he suspected undercover cops stopping by for a shakedown. In such a case, he would quickly slip into the ladies' room, where he knew no cop would ever dare to go. I was more self-determined than ever about how I spent my time on weekends when he was home with his family, and Louis was still uncomfortable with me going out to the city's now multiplying gay bars for a number of reasons, but primarily out of jealousy. That Christmas Day, I went out to Floral Park to have dinner with my father, mother, and James. Mom cooked as best she could, and I helped to make it as festive as I knew how. I had not a clue that it would be my very last Christmas with my mother. 1970. After the holidays, things with Louis went from bad to worse. I knew something was wrong, and when Louis's old friend Bill told me that Louis was seeing someone else, it came as no surprise. Shortly after that, Louis told me himself and said he wanted to stop seeing me. 2 years had passed since we met. A long time in the life of a 22-year-old. A whole range of emotions welled up in me, from anger to disappointment to dismay. Bill told me that the new boyfriend was the same age as I was and had straight blonde hair that fell down over his eyes. It was the beach boy look that Louis found so irresistible. I did not know what possessed me, but when I was at the drugstore on 86th Street, I saw a product on the shelf that promised to straighten your hair, so I dropped it into my basket along with a box of blonde dye. When I got home, I proceeded to straighten and dye my hair blonde. The blonde part went easy enough, but the hair straightener had rather precise directions about not leaving the potent chemical on your hair a minute longer than the time indicated. As I was awaiting the prescribed time, the telephone rang, and it was Bill. He was concerned about how I was holding up and talked at length in a motherly sort of way. He was insistent that I join him and a few others for dinner at Wright's on 86th Street that evening. When I hung up the phone, my scalp started to burn, and I realized I had this toxin in my hair way too long. I rushed to the mirror and was aghast to see a 1-inch red burn on my forehead below my hairline. Nevertheless, I hurried to get dressed and down to meet Bill on time. As I walked the 10 blocks to 86th Street, it began to rain rather heavily, and each raindrop that hit my head was like a nail driven into my skull. By the time I got to Wright's, I felt like I was wearing a crown of thorns. When Bill saw me, he cried out, "Oh, kid, what have you done to yourself?" Well, now I had the look, but I did not have the Louis. 2 weeks later, Louis called and wanted to talk. He said that he had made a big mistake and wanted to get back together again. I listened, but I had already realized that it was time for me to move on. Life is a one-way street. I told him that I did not want to see him anymore, and then asked him what he was going to do. Well, what choice do I have? I'll have to go back to him. And by the way, can I stop by to get my table that I gave you? With that, I just put the phone down gently and figured I would just never understand men or women. Now what am I to do for a table, I thought. Early the next month, March of 1970, the phone rang. In the moment between the first ring and the time I picked up the phone, I had a moment of clarity about the nature of this call. My mother was in the hospital to have what was said to be a routine hysterectomy. And that's where the writing ends. So what I know about his mother was that while she was getting her hysterectomy, they found out she had cancer. I don't remember if it was in her ovaries or her uterus or cervix. I don't remember where it was, but I do remember that it progressed very quickly. It was already pretty advanced, and Leo went out there to try to be with her, but he couldn't manage going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So he invited her to come live with him in the city because his father was having a total emotional breakdown, and neither of his brothers were able to be there to help her. So she moved in with him, and for a while, like, she recovered and felt very vivacious just being with him, as, you know, a mother's love for her son, and maybe even just moving into Manhattan from the outer reaches of Queens on the border of, you know, Nassau County could maybe revitalize someone. But she quickly declined, and he took care of her until she died. And I think it was around that time. Oh God, okay, no, I guess he wrote some notes about what happened, and I guess I got that wrong. He went out there and he tried to live with her for a while, and he sublet his apartment, but that did not work out. But in that process of going back and forth, he met a new Italian who he fell in love with named Sal. And I remember stories he told me. He showed me pictures of Sal, and, you know, they would again go out to Fire Island and swim in beaches, and he also started spending more time with those two priests, Father Robert and Father John. And Father John was a really good friend of Quentin Crisp, and so then he just started kind of hanging around with Quentin Crisp. And I know that eventually Father John and Father Robert and he and a few other men started the first openly gay church in America, that was called the Church of the Beloved Disciple. And they ended up buying a building on 14th Street. I mean, they for a while were at the church on I think like 25th Street and 9th Avenue. They would use it at off times, but then they ended up buying a building on 14th Street between 8th and 9th on the south side of the street that, last I know, was the Turntable Lab, which I think is hilarious. But they ended up buying the whole building, so the upstairs was the rectory, and the downstairs they turned into a church. And they would do some theatrical stuff there, but it was openly gay, and you know, a lot of people know MCC as being the first gay church in America, but it was MCC was started out in the West Coast, I believe, and so the Church of the Beloved Disciple was here in New York City, but it didn't continue the way MCC continued. But I know that Leo got really involved in gay liberation, and he was in the first Gay Pride Parade, and he tells a story about how he was wearing very tight white bell bottoms, and I don't know if it was raining, maybe it was raining, but or he got all wet from something, and he was on TV, and he was talking about he was, you know, being openly about who he was, and they had his name on television, and he said that for weeks he was getting calls from all these gay guys who thought he was so hot because he was wearing these see-through white tight pants, you know, in the first Gay Pride Parade. It was in the news. Yeah, so his mom died at the end of 1970. He went to Mexico the next year. I love this. Hepatitis spring. He ended up getting hepatitis and was very sick. And when he recovered, he ended up going to England for a while. He was sick like all summer. It was 1971. Active with Beloved Disciple after trip. So I guess Beloved Disciple started in the middle of 71. He broke up with Sal. In the spring of 72, he met a Puerto Rican named Miguel. And the stories he told me about Miguel terrified me about Puerto Ricans for a long time. He lived with Miguel for 2 years. I don't remember where their apartment was, but it might have actually been his one on the Upper East Side. But Miguel lived with him for a while, and at the end of the first year, he woke up one morning and found Miguel with his head in the oven with the gas on, trying to kill himself. And he pulled him out, and he was like, "What the hell are you doing?" Because, Leo was a smoker at the time, and he was like, "If I would have fucking lit a cigarette before I got out of bed, we'd be dead. The whole building would have exploded." And Miguel was crying mess and was just like, "Oh, I can't, bear to live anymore," because just the pain of being gay, back then, being a Puerto Rican, and the difficulty of his culture growing up, and all of the abuse that we all suffer growing up gay, and especially in smaller areas that were less advanced than New York City. And at the end of the second year that he lived with Miguel, one night Miguel decided he was going to kill himself again and pulled a big steak knife out of the kitchen and held Leo's head back and held the knife against his throat. Was like, "I'm going to kill myself, but I have to kill you first because I can't imagine anyone else having you." And Leo fought him off and kicked him out of the house. And again, Miguel was a crying mess, and he was like, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." Leo's like, "Yeah, well, you have to go live with some friends of mine, and you can't talk to me, and I don't want to ever see you again." And he changed the locks, and maybe he moved. Maybe that's what made him leave the house, just because he didn't want Miguel to know where he was. And that was the end of his relationship with Miguel. It says received habit December 3rd, 1972. So I know the story about that he and Robert and John went up to a monastery in Montreal. I forget the name of the man who ran the monastery there, but it was an old Catholic monastery. And the old Catholic order is very different than what we think of as the Roman Catholic. And so he got ordained as an old Catholic priest. And one of the things that allowed him to do is be openly gay. Because obviously as a Roman Catholic, you couldn't be openly gay. You still can't be openly gay very easily as a Roman Catholic. I don't know if Francis is changing that, but I know I've heard some talk of it. But Leo, even though he grew up Roman Catholic and he really loved, he's already said some things about kind of disliking the Vatican and what they do with the perpetuating of abuse. But he chose, to not serve as a Roman Catholic priest, and he became. But I know when he was in the Church of Beloved Disciple, he wasn't necessarily associating with the Episcopalians. He was ordained old Catholic. Minor orders, February 73. So I guess after he got ordained in December, received the habit. Oh no, that was Franciscan. That's what he got ordained as, an old Catholic Franciscan. That's what it was. So he took his Franciscan vows. And then he received minor orders in February 73 as a deacon in Montreal. Okay. And then in early 74, he moved to 14th Street. So that's the house, the building they bought, which was 324 West 14th Street. These addresses he likes to give. And he became a priest April 20th, 1974. Then he wrote out the years for the next decade, but he didn't have any notes in them there. Are there any notes here? No. So they're the rest of the notes he gave. So the stories that I know of the rest of his life in New York. He lived in the rectory for a while. He was not a good housekeeper. I remember having sex with some guy, this was probably 10 years ago now, who, in talking to him, it turns out that he remembers having gone home with Leo and talked about how messy the apartment was. And when I talked to Leo, he was like, "Oh yeah, that was definitely my apartment." I remember him telling me stories about, as a vestment maker, they have very specific color swatches to match, when you're making any kind of clothes, you have to match the colors, things. And very often he would have to go walk somewhere to get fabric to bring it back to the shop where he was making vestments. And that his boss once was like, "Okay, we need this, this, and this, and it needs to match this, this, and this." And Leo's like, "Okay, I'm going to go." And he's like, "Well, you need to take these swatches with you." And Leo's like, "Oh, no, I don't." And the boss was like, "Wah, wah, wah, wah," and Leo went and he came back, and the boss was totally shocked that he had perfect color matching in his vision. And I think, I don't know if you've seen, but I've seen now that there's videos that there's certain people, artists, or just other people who have a more acute color vision than the average person. And so, where a lot of us think that, oh, this is red, and that's brown, and this is black, and that's blue. We have this is kind of green or something. A lot of us think like that about colors. And some people, like Leo, he thought in incredibly intricate, he saw and he thought in incredibly intricate gradations of color. So even though he, I think, was partially deaf in one ear and left-handed and dyslexic, he had this kind of superhuman color gradient perception. He definitely told a lot of great stories about bathhouses in New York, and a lot of this writing, though, he did talk about gay culture. He didn't talk about sex so much. I remember him telling me a story about getting picked up on 3rd Avenue by some guy and going home with them and having sex with them and just thinking that this was amazing. And the guy tucked something into his front pocket and he thought it was his phone number. And when he got home, he pulled it out and feeling all like, wow, that was amazing sex. And I wonder if I see that guy again. And it wasn't the guy's phone number. It was just like $80 or something. And Leo was making $55 a week at that time. And he was just like, holy shit. So he was so shocked that he made so much money, but he was also terrified, or he's so angry that the guy thought that he was doing it for money. That was one of his sex stories. I know that eventually he moved out of the rectory, not because the church was having problems, but because he just wanted a different life, and he moved down to Wall Street, and he bought a loft there. And one of the things about there was a bathhouse down on Wall Street back then that was very active, a big gay bathhouse. And Leo used to go there, and the loft that he bought and he moved into with a couple friends, it still had, it was just huge loft, and it had commercial bathrooms. So they totally gutted the female bathroom and turned it into this gigantic big group shower. But they left the men's bathroom exactly as it was, kind of dirty and dingy, industrial, because that was hot, And he made up business cards, so he would go out to the bathhouse and sometimes just see guys on the street, and he would hand out this business card that would say Leo's Hot Lunch or something. And so married guys would come over to his place for lunch and sex in the middle of the day, and he told good stories about that, different scenes in the showers and so on and so forth. But in the 70s, New York just got more dangerous and more dangerous and more dangerous. And people talked about California and how great it was. And though he didn't have a great time in LA, he'd heard good things about San Francisco. And gay life back in the mid-70s was still just a constant party of sex and drugs and disco. And Leo was not so into discos. That wasn't his thing. But sex culture he really liked. And so, he had this wonderful sex culture thing going on in southern Manhattan. And although he talked about how his apartment up in the Upper East Side had got broken into many times, when he was down in Wall Street, he went out to San Francisco for a while. Or when he was living down on Wall Street, he went out to San Francisco for a while, and he had a really great visit. And when he came back, just a few weeks into being back, his loft got broken into. And as he was going home, the robbers were leaving his place, and I don't remember if they beat him up or if they just scared the shit out of him, but he fell into a terrible depression and got incredibly sick. And so he had always, even though he had gotten thinner and whatever, sexy, whatever, in normative thinking of a height proportioned person, most of his 30s or 20s, most of his 20s, after this scare in the loft of the robbers breaking in and almost killing him or something, he lost tons of weight, he got incredibly sick, and he decided that he was done with New York. And, started making his exit strategy. And he had some contacts in San Francisco and set up a place to go live, and the place he worked for in New York gave him contacts for a job he could get out there. But he also got some kind of job because he was a priest at this point, working in Africa. So between New York and San Francisco, he went to Africa for, I think, a few months. It might have been 4 months or 6 months. He doesn't have anything about that in his notes here. I just remember these stories he told me. Being in Africa. I don't even remember what part of Africa it was, but I do remember him telling me a story that it just was a totally different world, a totally different reality. He had no idea. He'd never encountered anything of being a New Yorker. Had no idea what he was encountering. And he told a story of they were going to put on a big meal for him. And so everybody, the whole little village was getting together, special things because he was this visiting American priest. And the kids were running around chasing these gigantic rats that were the size of like big fat cats. And he was just like, oh, is that what the kids do here? Because they have no games to play? And the person he was talking to was like, no, they're catching that for your dinner this evening. And he was like, oh. But he had he found that his time in Africa really changed him as far as just seeing, he had gone from this kind of like partying scene and not partying. I mean, he always had this spiritual undercurrent to everything he did, but still there was this constant pleasure seeking in New York and in San Francisco. It's one of the reasons he wanted to move there. But his time in Africa really opened up a different type of compassion to him about the world. And when he moved to San Francisco, he was there for a couple years of good fun. And when I say good fun, I mean he told me stories about making investments and shopping for fabrics and these kind of things, and meeting these people and going to these bars and going to these sex places. There was I don't know if it was a bathhouse or a sex club called the Slot that a lot of people talked about, and one called the Church. And of course he loved that because of his whole church thing and the way that he wasn't blasphemous necessarily, but he liked, just as much of a lot of people did, like getting into the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, that whole idea of like what oppresses us we can turn into this campy fun romp. So there was a place called the Church that he often went to, and he just talked of these amazing exalting experiences of staying out all night just having sex with people. But the way that he would often talk about having sex, even in that part of his life, was like it was this wonderful social thing. Like it wasn't like using each other in a darkroom situation, but being very friendly and being very present with each other. And then AIDS. So like he was only in San Francisco for a couple years before AIDS started becoming a really big deal. And in that process, I wouldn't say quickly switched, but he quickly got involved in hospice care. He wanted to be able to figure, because everybody was dying, and so he wanted to figure out how he could somehow help the situation. And he got involved he went through some training, and he got involved with a hospice care organization. And the first person they put him with was an old Frenchman who I believe was in his late 70s at the time, or maybe early 80s. No, he might have been 80. He might have been 80 when Leo was put with him. And I do remember the old Frenchman's name was Georges de Batz. And Georges was from France and had lived in New York for a long time and had lived in San Francisco, and he was very wealthy. And when Leo got the job, the organization said, look, this guy's a real asshole. We can't get anybody to stay with him. He scares everyone. He's horrible, but he's dying. He only has a few months left to live. So if you can stick it out, it would be really great. Because it would just be so much easier if you could just stay with him until he dies. And Leo, being the tough New Yorker character that he was like, okay, I can deal with that. George lived another 8 years. And that was one of the things that terrified me when I went out to be with Leo, and the doctors had said he only had 3 months left to live. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to have these 3 months left. And then it turned into 6 months, and I was just like, this is never going to end, and I don't want to move back to California from New York when my life in New York felt like it was just starting. But that story will be told later. So he took care of George for 8 years, and George was an asshole again, but in a French way, in a Parisian way. So a lot of people like that. A lot of people like the arrogance and the asshole of the Parisians. And I don't think Leo had dealt with that before. He'd never been to Paris. But one of the things George complained about was how bad food was. And Leo often complained about how bad food was. So Leo was like, well, why don't you teach me how to cook? And so George taught him how to cook, like in this incredibly rich French style. So Leo was an excellent cook by the time I met him. And within, I think, 5 or 6 years after being in San Francisco, it had turned into a nightmare of death. And, you've heard that story. So Leo already started trying to be like, okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next situation now as soon as George dies. So he was George until George died. And when George died, unbeknownst to Leo, he left Leo most of his money. Now, George, being the asshole, probably didn't have a lot of friends. And Leo, being he was smart in his way. But because he was a Franciscan, he had taken these vows as a Franciscan, which are poverty, chastity, and obedience, which a lot of my friends, when I was when I was in love, when we were whatever we were, a lot of my friends, when I was with him and I would talk about how he was a Franciscan and we'd have all this wonderful sex and go to sex parties and stuff, and I would say, oh, poverty, chastity, and obedience, they'd be like, oh, he's such a fucking hypocrite. And I was like, why? And they were like, well, if he's having all these sex and he's supposed to be chaste. I'm like, do you know what the word chaste means? And they're like, well, it means you're supposed to be celibate. And he was like, no, chastity's not about celibacy. And like, could be doublespeak. But Leo was incredibly educated in these kind of things. And he basically explained that it's just not about having children and not about ever having sex with women. So he would always, make quips about how he was still a virgin because he'd never had sex with women. But all this money that George gave him, he put in a trust that belonged to the church. Or he first used he first used the money to buy the cabin that he was living in when I met him. And he quickly gave the land that he bought to the diocese, the Episcopalian diocese that the cabin was in. He had a church built next door to it with this money, and then he put the rest of the money in a trust that he would get doled out to him. And he lived off of that for the next, I think it was 28 or 30 years or something. So that he didn't really need to work so much to survive. He liked to work, but he didn't have to work for money. He was able to not have to work for money. He did work. He got paid, but, just occasionally doing masses for people. And occasionally doing masses at the diocese in the area of Northern California he was, and some of the other Episcopalian churches up around that area. So when I met him, that was his financial story. His vision when he moved out of San Francisco and bought this cabin, and it had at that time 3 bedrooms in it, and he had set it up so that even more people could stay there. And he wanted it to be a Franciscan Brothers hermitage. So a lot of the people he knew from San Francisco, when they started dying of AIDS, he would invite them up there and he would say, okay, you can quietly come into a life of contemplation and, union with your spirit, with your Lord, whatever. And that never worked out, of course. He had various people that would come up and live with him, and they would just be depressed or become alcoholics or get involved with drugs. The area that he lived in was a very beautiful part of Northern California that had been totally fucked up. It was what's it called, Lake County, which was, I think, or at least it was at the time, the poorest county in California. And it was at one point in time very wealthy because that's where most people from San Francisco would go on vacation before airplane travel became available to the general public. So it was a place you could drive up to, and it had tons of little camps, like you see in the Catskills out here in New York or wherever you are. Might be watching this whenever you might watch this someday. But when all those things closed down, there was a lot of logging in that area, and the logging had totally changed the environment from a forest into a semi-arid desert. There were hot springs everywhere that they tapped into to try to make electricity and made a lot of them go cold. There were lakes everywhere that they drained so that they could turn it into farmland. So it just, I don't know about irrevocably, but it completely changed the climate from what it was when it was found by the white people. And when I lived with him up there, there were a lot of meth labs, pot growers, alcoholics. Lake County used to be famous for being the walnut and pear capital of America. And by the time I moved there wasn't much of that industry left. It had mostly turned into wine, and I know that it's now wine and marijuana mostly because intoxication sells really well in this country. Anyway, Leo, when I was helping him die and we were looking through all these pictures, we found tons of pictures of him like building the chapel with other people and other people coming up and helping him build the chapel. But he did a lot of himself and created beautiful flower beds and the evolution of the cabin. The cabin he was living in was like a kit cabin that some people had built. I think only one owner before him, a straight couple. It was, huge logs of wood that had been carved. I don't know if it was redwood. I think it was cedar that were carved into logs that fit into place. So he literally was living in a log cabin, but it was a nice log cabin with a beautiful deck and it overlooked a valley, and it was really beautiful. Leo's story. So yeah, Leo became a kind of part-time pastor of this small diocese, it was a big diocese, but of that small section of it. So he'd go around and do last rites and occasional interim pastorship of, like, if a priest needed a vacation, he would take a couple Sundays or something. And that's what he did for many years. And I'm just telling the story up until I met him, because then I'll take a break and then I'll tell more stories about what our relationship was actually like. And I know that all the different guys he took care of, like, none of them were boyfriend material. He eventually told me that he always was really attracted to broken biscuits, which, as he said earlier in the writings, that his minds were very much still in the Depression area. Oh, and his father died a few years after his mother died. I remember that. But there was this thing once upon a time in England and in America, I don't know if they still do this, where I don't think they do, where instead of, if there's like a brand name like Chips Ahoy or Oreos that's selling cookies, then there would be an off-brand version of, not an off-brand, but I guess it's like you'd buy it at different stores where you'd buy the broken cookies. So in England they called them broken biscuits. And Leo always felt like those were the people he was most attracted to, the people who were damaged and that needed help. And of course I was like, yeah. But in his dying process, I was like, oh, that's why he was always so attracted to me, because I'm a broken biscuit. Oh no. But he had a lot of broken biscuits up at his hermitage that he tried to help, and over the years they would end up moving back to the city, because as the HIV meds got better, it was just better for them to go back in the city. But many of them, when they died anyway, he would take their ashes. So when he was dying, I think there were like 9 people in the altar of the chapel. 9 people. Ashes, I mean. And I ended up digging a sepulcher for him, for all of those ashes and for his own to be mixed in. Anyway, so that's the way he'd been living. Oh, yes, so he would occasionally go back to the city. He had to learn how to drive. He learned how to drive in his 40s because he never learned how to drive in New York. But to live up there, he had to learn how to drive, although I think he lived up there for a while without learning to drive because some of the people up there knew how to drive. But eventually he learned how to drive, and he'd go back to the city. And unfortunately, I don't know the origin story, but he met a man named Michael, who was originally from Illinois. So that was a nice connection, because I'm from Indiana, and he was like, oh. And Michael was a Virgo. And Michael, and he became lovers, though they never lived together. And Michael had a car, and so would drive up and see him sometimes, but usually Leo had to drive down to see Michael. And I know they were really into ab fab. They called each other sweetie darling a lot. And they drank a lot. And when I met Leo, I didn't think he was an alcoholic or had an alcohol problem or anything, but he was always like, oh, it's cocktail hour, or it's time for a cocktail. And I would just be like, oh, well, this is a normal thing that gay people did. At that time in my life, in my early 20s, I was just like, this is just what gay people do. I was very much, I've always been a very judgmental person, but I didn't have a scope of understanding the world so much in my early 20s. So when I would see gay people drinking all the time, I just thought this is just normal, and this is what gay people do, and that it wasn't a problem. But whenever I saw Leo, it was always cocktails and a couple of bottles of wine. Anyway, and I know that he and Michael had a very good time with that. They always had nice meals, and they always had a lot of alcohol. And I guess that's probably good enough to set up the scene. By the time I met Leo, he was living alone. He was still very much with Michael, but I think they had just stopped having sex for years or something. They just hadn't been having sex anymore, which is normal. But I think they'd been together for like 9 years, 8 or 9 years, as partners or friends. Yeah, Leo was trying to make it work as a hermit. Okay, so I'm going to end this section and take a break and upload it and stuff, and then I'll get back and just tell more stories about my relationship with Leo. Happy birthday, Leo. I love you.